Hey guys, I hope you're all doing really well and hope you had a good holiday season. So today we're reading part 8 of Cinder by Marissa Meyer. Part 3, Chapter 21. Cinder slumped down at her work desk, relieved to finally be out of that stifling apartment. Not only was the air system down, again, with the maintenance nowhere to be seen, but the awkwardness between her and Adri bordered on unbearable. They'd been tiptoeing around each other since she'd returned home from the lab 2 days before, Adri trying to remind Cinder of her superiority by ordering her to defrag their apartment's entire mainframe and update all the software that they didn't use anymore, while at the same time update all the software that they didn't even use anymore, while at the same time lurking around as if she were, almost kind of, ashamed of what she'd done to Cinder. But Cinder was probably imagining that last part. At least Pearl had been gone all day and had only shown up when Cinder and Eco were on their way out to work on the car. Another long day, another late night. The car was going to take more work than she realized. The entire exhaust system needed to be replaced, which meant manufacturing a lot of parts herself, which created any number of headaches. She had a feeling she wasn't going to get much sleep if they were going to have it road ready by the night of the ball. She sighed. The ball. She didn't regret saying no when the prince had asked her, because she knew how badly that would end. Any number of things could go wrong, from tripping on the stairs and flashing the prince a sexy metal thigh, to running into Pearl or Adri or someone from the market. People would talk. The gossip channels were sure to look into her past, and pretty soon the whole world would know that the prince had taken a cyborg to his coordination ball. He would be mortified. She would be mortified. It didn't make it any easier when she wondered, what if she were wrong? What if Prince Kai wouldn't care? What if the world were different and nobody cared if she was cyborg? And on top of that, a lunar. Yeah, wishful thinking. Spotting the broken net screen on the carpet, she peeled herself off the chair and kneeled before it. The black screen was just reflective enough for her to see the outline of her face and body. The tan skin of her arms contrasted with the dark seal of her hand. Denial had run its course until it had nowhere to go. She was lunar. But she was not afraid of the mirrored surface, not afraid of her own reflection. She couldn't understand what Levana and their kind, found so disturbing about it. Her mechanical parts were the only disturbing thing in Cinder's reflection, and that had been done here on Earth. Lunar and cyborg, and a fugitive. Did Adri know? No, Adri would never have housed a lunar. If she'd known, she would have turned Cinder in herself, probably expecting payment. Had her husband known? That was a question Cinder would probably never know the answer to. Nevertheless, she was confident that so long as Dr. Erlin didn't say anything, her secret would be safe. She would just have to go on as if nothing had changed. In many ways, nothing had. She was every bit an outcast as ever. A white blob caught her eye on the screen's surface. Kai's android, its lifeless sensor staring down at her from its perch on top of the desk. Its pear-shaped body was the brightest thing in the room and probably the cleanest. It reminded her of the sterile medroids in the labs and the quarantines. But this machine did not have scalpels and syringes hidden in its torso. Work. Mechanics. She needed the distraction. Returning to her desk, she turned on her audio interface for some tranquil background music. Kicking off her boots, she gripped both sides of the android and wheeled it toward her. After a quick examination of its external plating, she tipped the android over, laying it horizontal so that it balanced on the edge of its treads. Cinder opened the back panel and inspected the wiring through the cylindrical frame. It was not a complicated android. The interior was mostly hollow, a shell for housing a minimum of hard drives, wires, chips. Tutor androids required little more than a central processing unit. Cinder suspected that the android would have to be wiped and reprogrammed, but she had a feeling that wasn't a viable option. Despite Kai's nonchalance, it was clear this android knew something important, and after their conversation in the research hall, she had an uneasy feeling it had something to do with the Lunars. War strategies, classified communication, evidence for blackmail, whatever it was, Kai thought it would help, and he trusted Cinder to save it. No pressure or anything, she muttered, gripping a flashlight between her teeth so she could see inside the android. She grabbed a pair of pliers and coerced the wires from one side of its cranium to the other. Its configuration was similar to Eco's, Cinder felt a familiarity with its parts, knew exactly where to find all the important connections. She checked that the wire connectors were sound, that the battery held power, that no important pieces were missing, and everything seemed fine. She cleaned out the noise translator and adjusted the internal fan, but 9Z the android remained a lifeless statue of plastic and aluminum. "All dressed up with nowhere to go," said Ego from the doorway. Cinder spit out the flashlight with a laugh and glanced down at her oil-stained cargo pants. "Yeah, right, all I need is a tiara. I was talking about me." She spun her chair around. Ego had draped a strand of Adri's pearls around her bulbous head and smeared cherry lipstick beneath her censer in a horrible imitation of lips. Cinder laughed. "Wow, that's a great color on you. Do you think?" Ego wheeled her way into the room and paused before Cinder's desk, trying to catch her reflection in the net screen. "I was imagining going to the ball and dancing with the prince." Cinder rubbed her jaw with one hand and mindlessly tapped the table with the other. "Funny, I've been thinking about the same thing lately. I knew you liked him. You pretend to be immune to his charms, but I could tell by the way you looked at him at the market." Ego rubbed at the lipstick, smearing it across her blank white chin. "Yeah, well," Cinder pinched her metal fingers with the pliers nose. "We all have our weaknesses." "I know," said Ego. "Mine is shoes." Cinder tossed the tool onto her desk. Something like guilt was beginning to grow in her when Ego was around. She knew she should tell Ego about being lunar, that Ego more than anyone would understand what it was like to be different and unwanted. But somehow she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. "What are you doing down here?" she asked instead. "Just seeing if you need help. I'm supposed to be dusting the air vents, but Adri was in the bath." "So?" I could hear her crying. Cinder blinked. "Oh. It was making me feel useless." "I see." Ego was not a normal servant android, but she did retain one prominent trait. Uselessness was the worst emotion they knew. "Well, sure, you can help," Cinder said, rubbing her hands together. "Just don't let her catch you with those pearls." Ego lifted the beaded necklace with her prongs, and Cinder noticed she was wearing the ribbon Peony had given her. She pulled back as if she'd been stung. "How about some light?" The blue sensor brightened, shedding a spotlight into Nancy's interior. Cinder twisted up her lips. "Do you think it could have a virus?" Maybe her programming was overwhelmed by Prince Kai's uncanny hotness. Cinder flinched. "Can we please not talk about the prince?" "I don't think that will be possible. You're working on his android after all. Just think about the things she knows, the things she's seen." And Ego's voice sputtered. "Do you think she's seen him in the nude?" "Oh, for heaven's sake." Cinder yanked off her gloves and tossed them on the table. "You're not helping. I'm just making conversation." "Well, stop." Crossing her arms over her chest, Cinder pushed the chair back from the work table and swung up both legs to rest on top of it. "It has to be a software issue." She sneered to herself. Software issues usually came down to reinstallation, but that would turn the android into a blank slate. She didn't know if Kai was concerned with the android's personality chip, which had probably developed into something quite complicated after 20 years of service. But she did know Kai was concerned with something in the android's hard drive, and she didn't want to risk wiping whatever it was. The only way to determine what was wrong and if a reboot was necessary was to check the android's internal diagnostics, and that required plugging in. Cinder hated plugging in. Connecting her own wiring with a foreign object always felt hazardous, like if she wasn't careful, her own software could be overwritten. Chastising herself for being squeamish, she reached for the panel in the back of her head. Her fingernail caught the small latch and swung it open. What is that?" Cinder stared at Ego's outstretched prong. "What's what?" "That chip." Cinder dropped her feet to the floor and leaned forward. She squinted in the far back of the model, where a row of tiny chips stood like soldiers along the bottom of the control panel. There were 20 plugs in all, but only 13 of them were full. Manufacturers always left room for add-ons and updates. Ego had spotted the 13th chip, and she was right. Something was different about it. It was tucked far enough behind the other chips that it was easy to miss with a cursory glance, but when Cinder targeted it with the flashlight, it gleamed like polished silver. Cinder shut the panel in the back of her head and called up the digital blueprint of the android's model on her retina. According to the manufacturer's original plans, this model only came with 12 chips. But surely, after 20 years, the android would have received at least one add-on. Surely, the palace had access to the finest, newest programs available. Still, Cinder had never seen a chip quite like that. She pressed a fingernail into the release switch and gripped the edge of the silver chip with the pliers. It slid like grease from its plug. Cinder held it up for close inspection. With the exception of the pearlescent, shimmering finish, it looked like every other program chip she'd seen. Flipping it over, she saw the letters D-COM engraved on the other side. Is that so? She lowered her arm. What is it? Asked Eco. A direct communication chip. Cinder furrowed her brow. Almost all communication was done through the net. Direct communication that bypassed the net entirely was practically obsolete, as it was slow and had a tendency to lose connection in the middle of a link. She supposed paranoid types who required absolute privacy would find direct comms appealing, but even then, they would use a port or net screen, a device that was set up for it. Using an android as one side of the link didn't make any sense. Eco's light dimmed. My database informs me that androids have not come equipped with direct communication abilities since 89 TE, which would explain why it didn't work with her programming. Cinder held the chip toward Eco. Can you run a material scan, see what it's made out of? Eco backed away. Absolutely not. Having a mental breakdown is not on my list of things to do today. It doesn't seem like it would have caused her to malfunction, though. Wouldn't the system have just rejected it? Cinder angled the chip back and forth, mesmerized by how its reflective surface caught Eco's light. Unless she tried to send information over the direct link, it could have jammed up the bandwidth. Standing, Cinder strolled across the storage space toward the net screen. Though its frame had been shattered, the screen and controls seemed undamaged. She slid the chip in and pressed the power button, having to jab it harder than usual before a pale green light came to life beside the drive and the screen flared bright blue. A spiral in the corner announced that it was reading the new chip. Cinder released her breath and folded her legs beneath her. A second later, the spiral disappeared, replaced with text. Initiating direct link with unknown user. Please wait. Cinder waited, and wiggled her foot, and waited, and drummed her fingers against her knee, and began to wonder if she were wasting her time. She never heard of a direct communication chip hurting anything, even if the technology was archaic. This wasn't helping her solve the problem. I guess no one's home, said Ego, rolling up behind her. Her fan turned on, blowing warm air on Cinder's neck. Oh, drat, Adri is calming me. She must be out of the bath. Cinder tilted her head back. Thanks for the help. Don't forget to take those pearls off before you see her. Tilting forward, Ego pressed her flat, cool face to Cinder's brow, no doubt leaving a smudge of lipstick. Cinder laughed. You'll find out what's wrong with His Highness's android. I don't doubt that. Thanks. Cinder rubbed her clammy palm on her pants, listening as Ego's treads got farther away. The text continued to repeat across the screen. It seemed whoever was on the other side of the link had no intention of answering. A series of clicks startled her, followed by telltale humming. She turned around, propping her knuckles on the gritty floor. The android's control panel was glowing as the system ran through its routine diagnostics. It was turning back on. Cinder stood and dusted her hands just as a calm female voice began to emanate from the android speakers, as if it were continuing a speech that had been rudely interrupted. Suspected that the man by the name of Logan Tanner, a lunar doctor who worked under the reign of Queen Shannary, first brought Princess Celine to Earth approximately 4 months after her alleged death. Cinder froze. Princess Celine? Unfortunately, Tanner was admitted to the Zooming psychiatric hospital on 8th of May 125 TE and committed bioelectric suicide on 17th of January 126 TE. The sources indicate that Princess Celine had been given to another keeper years before Tanner's death. I have thus far not been able to confirm the identity of that keeper. One suspect is an ex-military pilot from the European Federation, Wing Commander Michel Benoit, who— Stop, said Cinder. Stop talking. The voice silenced. The android's head rotated 180 degrees. Its sensor flashed bright blue as it scanned Cinder. Her internal control panel dimmed. The fan in her torso began to spin. Who are you? Said the android. My global positioning system indicates that we are in the 76th sector of New Beijing. I have no memory of leaving the palace. Cinder straddled her seat, draping her arms over the back. Welcome to New Beijing's mechanic suite. Prince Kai hired me to fix you. The loud humming in the android's torso died down until it was barely discernible, even in the quiet room. The bulbous head rotated back and forth, scanning its unfamiliar surroundings. Then refocused on Cinder. My calendar tells me I have not been conscious for over 12 days, 15 hours. Did I experience a system crash? Not exactly, said Cinder, glancing over her shoulder at the net screen. It continued to repeat the same line of text, unable to establish the direct link. It seems someone installed a COM chip that didn't meld well with your programming. I come pre-installed with vid and text COM capabilities. A new COM chip would be unnecessary. This was for a direct link. Cinder settled her chin on her wrist. Do you know if it was Prince Kai? If he maybe wanted to get in touch with you without going through the net. I was unaware of any direct communication chip in my programming. Cinder chewed her lip. Clearly the COM chip had been responsible for the android's sudden malfunction, but why? And if Kai hadn't installed it, then who had? When you woke up just now, she said, you were talking about you have information on the lunar air. That information is classified. You should not have heard it. I know, but I think you were probably communicating it to someone when you were disabled. Cinder prayed that it had been Kai or someone loyal to him. She doubted that Queen Lavanna would be too happy to know that the soon-to-be emperor was searching for the rightful heir to her throne. Hold still, she said, reaching for her screwdriver. I'll put your panel back on and then take you to the palace. In the meantime, you should download the news broadcast from the last few days. All that's happened since you've been out. Chapter 22. Cinder could hear Dr. Erlin's warnings in her head, echoing like a damaged audio file the entire 6 miles to the palace. Queen Lavanna will stop at nothing to ensure her control, to terminate any resistance. That means killing those who could resist her, people like you. If she were to see you, she would kill you. And yet, if something were to happen between the apartment and the palace to this android who had real information on the missing lunar princess, Cinder would never forgive herself. It was her responsibility to get the android back to Kai, safe and sound. Besides, the palace was a huge place. What were the chances she would run into the Lunar Queen, who probably didn't intend to spend much time socializing with the citizenry anyway? 9Z was much faster on her treads than Eco, and Cinder had to hurry to keep up with her. But their pace slowed as they discovered they were not the only citizens on their way to the palace that afternoon. At the base of the cliff, the main road had been blocked off as it left the city behind and became the private drive of the palace, shaded by twisted pines and drooping willows. The winding street was filled with pedestrians making their way up the hill. Some walked alone, others in large cliques. Their conversations reached Cinder, irate and determined, arms flying in mad gestures. We don't want her here. What could His Highness be thinking? The growing roar of the mob echoed down the road. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of angry voices chanting in unison. No Moon Queen, no Moon Queen. Turning the last corner, Cinder's gaze fell on the crowd up ahead, filling up the courtyard before the palace's maroon gates and spilling down the street. It was barely contained by a flustered row of security guards. Signs bobbed over their heads. War is better than slavery. We need an empress, not a dictator. No alliance with evil. Many included the Queen's veiled image slashed through with red X's. Half a dozen news hovers circled the sky, capturing footage of the protest for global broadcasting. Cinder skirted the edge of the crowd, shoving her way to the main gate while trying to shield 9Z's compact body with her own. But upon reaching the gate, she found it closed and guarded by both humans and androids, standing shoulder to shoulder. Pardon me, she said to the closest guard. I need to get into the palace. The man stretched his arm toward her, pushing her back a step. But I'm not with... Oh, no entrance to the public today. But I'm not with them. She placed her hands on 9Z's head. This android belongs to His Imperial Highness. I was hired to fix her, and now I'm returning her. It's very important that she return to him as soon as possible. The guards peered down his nose at the android. Did His Imperial Highness give you a pass? Well, no, but does the android have its ID? I do. Rotating her torso, 9Z flashed her ID code at the guard. He nodded. You may enter. The gates were open, just barely, and it wasn't a breath before the crowd surged forward. Cinder cried out at the rumble of angry voices in her ears and the sudden crush of bodies, shoving her into the security guard. Ninesy rolled through the gate without hesitation, but when Cinder moved to slip through behind her, the guard blocked her with his arm, straining against the crowd. Just the android. "But we're together," she yelled over the chanting. "No pass, no entrance. But I fixed her. I needed to deliver her. I need to collect payment." Even she was put off by the whining in her voice. "Send your invoice to the treasury like everyone else," the man said. "No one else is admitted without an issued pass." "Lin May," said Ninesy from the other side of the iron gate. "I will inform Prince Kai that you would like to see him. I'm sure he can calm you an official pass." Instantly, Cinder felt the weight of her silliness. Of course she didn't need to see the prince. She delivered the android, her job was done. And she wasn't going to bill him for her work anyway. But Ninesy had turned away and rolled off toward the palace's main entrance before Cinder could protest, leaving Cinder to come up with a reasonable excuse as to why she wanted to see Kai. Something better than the very stupid, very childish reason that first entered her head. She simply wanted to. The chanting stopped suddenly, making Cinder jump. The crowd's silence created a vacuum on the street, yearning to fill with breath, with sound, with anything. Cinder looked around at the dazzled faces turned upward to the palace, at the lowered signs held in limp fingers. A ripple of fear stroked her spine. She followed the gazes of the crowd up to a balcony that jutted from one of the palace's highest stories. The Lunar Queen stood with one hand on her hip, the other on the balcony's railing. Her expression was stern, bitter, but the look did nothing to dispel her uncanny beauty. Even from afar, Cinder could make out the pale luminescence of her skin, the ruby tinge of her lips. Her dark eyes were scanning the silenced crowd, and Cinder shrank back from the gate, wanting to disappear behind the empty faces. But the shock and terror were short-lived. This woman was not frightening, not dangerous. She was warm, welcoming, generous. She should be their queen. She should rule them, guide them, protect them. Cinder's retina display flashed a warning at her. She tried in vain to wink it away and wipe ahead the distraction. She wanted to look upon the queen forever. She wanted the queen to speak, to promise peace and security, wealth and comfort. The orange light beamed in the corner of her vision. It took Cinder a moment to realize what it was, what it meant. She knew it was out of place. She knew it didn't make sense. Lies. She squeezed her eyes shut. When she looked up again, the illusion of goodness had faded. The queen's sweet smile had turned haughty and controlling. Cinder's stomach curdled. She was brainwashing them. She had brainwashed her. Cinder stumbled back a step, colliding with the senseless middle-aged man. The queen's gaze jerked toward them, focusing on Cinder. Watched a surprise flicker over her face, then hatred, disgust. Cinder flinched, wanting to hide. Cold fingers clamped over her heart. She was compelled to run, yet her legs had melted beneath her. Her retina display was drawing confusing lines over her vision, as if it couldn't stand to look upon the queen's glamour a moment longer. She felt naked and vulnerable, all alone in the brainwashed crowd. She was sure the earth beneath her feet would open up and swallow her whole. She was sure the queen's gaze would turn her into a pile of ashes on the cobblestone road. The queen's glower darkened until Cinder began to feel that, tear ducts or not, she would burst into tears. But then the queen spun away, her shoulders back as she stormed the palace. With the queen gone, Cinder expected the crowd to take up their protest again, even angrier that she had dared show herself. But they didn't. Slowly, as if sleepwalking, the crowd began to depart. Those with signs let them fall to the ground, to be trampled and forgotten. Cinder pulled back against the wall, bordering the palace, out of the way as the citizens meandered past. So is the effect of the lunar glamour, the spell to enchant, to deceive, to turn one's heart toward you and against your enemies. And amid all those people who despised the Lunar Queen, Cinder seemed to be the only one who had resisted her. And yet she hadn't resisted her, not at first. Gooseflesh covered her arms, her skin ached where it melted with metal. She had not been entirely immune to the glamour, the way shells were supposed to be. Worse still, this queen had seen her, and she had known. Chapter 23. Kai dug his fingernails into his knees when the chanting of the protesters ceased. Torn turned toward him, their expressions mirrors of surprise, though Torin was quicker to disguise it. The Queen's success at calming the crowd had been far too easy. Kai had hoped for at least a hint of struggle from his citizens. Gulping, Kai morphed his face back into collectedness. "It is the most useful trick," said Sybil, sitting on the edge of the chase lounge by the holographic fire, "particularly when dealing with unruly citizens, which are never tolerated on Luna. I've heard that when citizens are truly unruly, there's usually good reason for it," said Kai. Torin flashed him a warning frown, but he ignored it. "And brainwashing doesn't seem exactly like the proper solution." Sybil folded her hands politely in her lap. Proper is such a subjective word. The solution is effective, and it can hardly be argued with." Levana flew back to the parlor with clenched fists. Kai's pulse ratcheted them when the Queen's glare fell on them. Being in her presence was like sitting in a confined room that was quickly running out of oxygen. "It would appear," she said, carefully enunciating each word, "that you are in violation of the Interplanetary Agreement of 54 TE, Article 17. Kai tried his best to remain neutral under her accusation, but he couldn't keep a twitch from developing above his right eye. "I'm afraid I do not have the Interplanetary Agreement memorized in full. Perhaps you could enlighten me as to the article in question." She took a slow breath through flared nostrils. Even then, even with all the hatred and anger smeared across her face, she was stunning. "Article 17 states that no party of the agreement shall knowingly shelter or protect lunar fugitives." "Lunar fugitives?" Kai glanced at Torin, but his advisor's face was neutral. "Why would you think we're sheltering lunar fugitives?" "Because I've just seen one in the courtyard, along with those insolent protesters. This is not to be tolerated." Kai stood and folded his arms over his chest. "This is the first time I've ever heard of lunars in my country. Present company excluded, of course. Which leads me to believe that you've been turning a blind eye to the problem, just as your father did." "How can I turn a blind eye to something I've never heard of?" Torin cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I can assure you we monitor all spacecrafts coming to and leaving the Commonwealth. Though we can't deny the possibility of some lunars being smuggled under our radar, I promise we've done everything in our power to comply with the Interplanetary Agreement. Besides, if a lunar fugitive had come to reside in the Commonwealth, it seems unlikely that they would choose to risk being discovered by coming to a protest when they knew you would be present. Perhaps you've been mistaken." The Queen's eyes smoldered. "I know my own when I see them, and right now there is one in these city walls. She pointed a finger toward the balcony. "I want her found and brought to me." "Right," said Kai. "That'll be no problem in a city of 2.5 million people. Let me just go out and dig out my lunar detector, and I'll get right on that." Levana tilted her head back so she could peer down her nose at Kai, even though he was taller than she was. "You do not wish to try my patience with your sarcasm, young prince." He flexed his jaw. "If you are incapable of finding her, then I will have a regiment of my own guards dispersed to Earth, and they will find her." "That will not be necessary," said Torin. "We apologize for doubting you, Your Majesty, and we are eager to fulfill our country's part of the agreement. Please allow us time to prepare for the coronation and the festival, and we will begin our search for the fugitive as soon as resources allow." Levana narrowed her eyes at Kai. "Do you always intend to let your advisor make your decisions for you?" "No," said Kai, allowing a cold smile. "Eventually I'll have an empress for that." Queen Levana's gaze softened, and Kai barely bit back his next words. "And it won't be you." "Fine," said Levana, turning away and seating herself beside Sybil. "I will expect her, along with any other lunar fugitives in the country, delivered to Luna one moon cycle after your coronation." "Fine," said Kai, hoping that Levana would forget this conversation before the time came. Lunars in New Beijing. He'd never heard anything so absurd. The anger vanished so completely from Levana's face that it seemed the past few minutes had been a dream. She crossed her legs so that the slit in her sheer dress displayed a swath of milk-white skin. Kai set his jaw and stared out the window, not knowing if he was going to blush or gag. "Speaking of your coronation," said the Queen, "I have brought you a gift." How thoughtful, he deadpanned. Yes, I wasn't sure if I should save it for the big night, but I've determined that it might give you the wrong impression if I were to withhold it. Unable to deny his piqued curiosity, Kai eyed the queen. Is that so? She inclined her head, auburn curls cascading over her bosom, and extended her fingers toward her second thaumaturge, the man in the red coat. He produced a glass vial no longer than Kai's pinky finger from his sleeve and placed it on Levana's palm. I want you to know, said Levana, that I have been taken very keen interest in the welfare of the Commonwealth. And it appears my scientists have finally discovered an antidote. Blood rushed to Kai's head. What? Levana pinched the vial between her thumb and forefinger and held it out to him. This should be enough to cure one adult male, she said, then clicked her tongue. Awful timing, isn't it? The world spun. Kai's fingers itched to reach out and strangle her until his entire arms were shaking. Go ahead, said Levana, a persistent warmth behind her gaze. Take it. Kai snatched the vial away from her. How long have you had this? The queen's brow arched upward. Why, it was only confirmed as a true antidote hours before my departure. She was lying. She was not even trying to hide the fact that she was lying. Which, Your Highness, Torn said quietly, placing a firm hand on Kai's shoulder. At first gentle, then squeezing. A warning. Kai's pulse began to filter the fantasies of murder, but only barely. Levana folded her hands in her lap. That vial is your gift. I hope you find it helpful, young prince. I believe it is in both of our interests to rid your planet of this disease. My scientists could have thousands of dosages prepared by month's end. However, such an undertaking, coupled with 6 years' worth of work and resources, has put quite a strain on my own country, so I'm sure you'll understand the need for compensation. That will require further negotiations. Kai's lungs constricted. You would withhold this when so many people are dying? It was a stupid question. She'd already withheld it long enough. What was it to her if more Earthens suffered in the meantime? You have much to learn about politics. I think you will soon discover that this is all about give and take, my dear handsome prince. His pulse pounded against his temples. He knew his face had gone red, that his anger was playing right into her game, but he didn't care. How dare she use this as a political bargaining chip? How dare she? Sybil stood suddenly. We have a guest. Releasing a pent-up breath, Kai followed Sybil's gaze to the doorway, glad to look away from the queen, and gasped, 9Z. 9Z's sensor flashed. Your Highness, I apologize for my interruption. Kai shook his head, trying to dispel his surprise. How? When? My consciousness has been restored for 1 hour and 47 minutes, said the android. And I am now reporting for duty. Might I offer my condolences on the untimely loss of Emperor Rikan? My heart is broken from the news. Kai heard Queen Levana snort behind him. The idea that a pile of metal could experience emotion is insulting. Send this monstrosity away. Kai pursed his lips, having a number of choice words to say about her heartlessness, but instead he turned to Torn. Indeed, let me remove this monstrosity from Her Majesty's presence and have her reinstated into active status. He half expected Torn to chastise him for the sorry escape plan, but Torn seemed too relieved when the argument was over. Kai noted that he'd gone pale and wondered how hard it had been for Torn to dominate his own temper. Of course, perhaps Her Majesty would like a tour of the gardens. Kai glared at Queen Levana, filling the look with loathing, and clipped his heels together. Thank you for your considerate gift, he said with a short bow. It was my pleasure, Your Highness. Kai left the room with 9Z at his side. When they had reached the main corridor, he released a guttural scream and slammed his fist into the nearest wall, then fell against it, pressing his forehead against the plaster. When his breathing was manageable, he turned around, suddenly wanting to cry. From anger, from desperation, from relief. 9Z was back. You can't imagine how happy I am to see you. So it appears, Your Highness. Kai shut his eyes. You don't even know. These past few days, I was sure our research would be lost. All records seem to be intact, Your Highness. Good. We need to get back to the search right away. It's more important now than ever. He struggled to contain the panic clawing at his insides. The coronation was still 9 days away. Queen Levana had not been on Earth for 24 hours, and she'd already turned their alliance negotiations upside down. What other secrets could she reveal before his coronation, when the role to protect his country would truly fall on him? His head pounded. He despised her, for everything she was, for everything she'd done, for how she turned Earth's suffering into a game of politics. But she was wrong if she expected him to become her puppet. He would defy her for as long as he could, in any way that he could. He would find Princess Celine. Dr. Erland would duplicate the antidote. He wouldn't even dance with Lamana at the stupid ball if he could help it. To hell with diplomacy. Remembering the ball suddenly parted the storm clouds in Christ's thoughts. Opening one eye, he peered down at the android. Why didn't the mechanic come with you? She did, said Ninety. I left her waiting outside the palace. She was not allowed entrance without an official pass. Outside the palace? Is she still here? I suspect so, your highness. Kai squeezed the vial in his pocket. I don't suppose she said anything about the ball, if she's changed her mind. She did not mention any ball. Right, well. Gulping, he freed his hands from his pockets and rubbed his palms down the side of his pants, realizing how hot his bottled anger had made him. I really hope she has.